This is day 6 of the June-July 87 7-day retreat. Before we get into the main part of the talk, there were 2 questions in connection with awareness that I remember right now. There may have been more. One person asked whether awareness always needs an object to be aware of. Does attention need an object to attend to? The awareness that we have been talking about, that we are talking about, is not dependent on any object, on any sound or sight or feeling. When sound, sight, feeling is there, it's there. When it is not, it's not. This doesn't affect the awareness, increase it or diminish it. It's like a mirror. When something appears, the mirror reflects it. When nothing appears, the mirror doesn't disappear. It's just nothing reflected in it. One could imagine going into a dark room in which is no light, no sound, soundproof. Would the listening stop? Would the seeing stop because there's nothing to see and to hear? Of course, there would still be the breathing, the beating of the heart and the touch of the feet on the floor and whatever other physical sensations. So the breathing, obviously, is perceived without needing to be concentrated upon. But just because there's darkness and no sound doesn't mean there's no seeing and no listening. That is a state of mind, not dependent on objects and yet not separate from them when they're there. Does it make sense? Another thing that was mentioned was a person saying, when I find I've been carried away by barrages of thought, and I come to, it's very helpful to listen to the breathing. It's not that I concentrate on it, or that listening to the breathing is exclusive of other sounds. But it has a very helpful effect on the whole organism, just to quietly listen to the breathing. Which it does. One can see that. One can feel it. But to beware that the mind doesn't close in on it, zero in on it. because then again everything else becomes a distraction which has to be battled. The openness of listening or attending can be there even though there is maybe some special attention given to the breathing. Nothing that's said here ever implies do it or don't do it. We're looking at things together. And can one look for oneself? Whether what is said is so. We talked about that in the very first talk, not taking the words that are said here as coming from authority. A number of people have spoken of concern about their selfishness. In observing thoughts, ideas, images, one finds that almost all of them rotate around this self, oneself. One's desires, one's hurts, one's ambitions, ache of loneliness, need for love, companionship. Always in the middle of it, me. The feeling and thought of myself. One person said, as I reflect over my whole life, it seems my whole life has been very superficial. Superficial in doing and being concerned about what I want, what feels right to me. And I'm even wondering whether I'm not hurtful to people, I'm gentle with people, because I myself don't want to feel their hurt if I were to hurt them. So, is there also selfishness or self-centeredness in not hurting people? Because I don't want to be the one who hurts them or feel their hurt. I think this is a valid question, which cannot be settled on any kind of thinking level. One has to observe as these situations arise. So easily one says, well, I don't know. I don't know whether I am selfish at this moment or not. I don't know whether I am concerned about not hurting because I don't want to hurt myself. It's so easily said to brush something that seems arduous out of the way. One can say, I don't know, but does this I don't know mean I don't want to bother with it? Or I really don't know, so let me find out. I want to find out what goes on as a situation arises. Is it possible to see thoughts, ideas, words that indicate motive, fear of consequences? And one may find to one's surprise, if one gives one's whole being to this kind of inquiry, which is arduous, much easier to say, I don't know. One may find to one's surprise that things do reveal themselves. We talk to ourselves about things. We verbalize things before we do something. Before we say something even, we may have quickly rehearsed it already, as it were. All of this becomes visible with the instrument of attention, just like so much becomes visible with a microscope or a telescope, which the ordinary eye does not detect. Or one may notice something, one hasn't even had any intention to pay attention, and all of a sudden one sees something, a motive or whatever. And if the selfish motive, self-centered, we're not saying selfish or self-centered in any judgmental way, it's important to emphasize this. These words are loaded. Because we think we're bad when we're selfish, so we want to not be selfish and act altruistically. And as this person says, he's becoming very suspect of what looks like altruism and wonders whether there's not also a selfish motive there. Selfish means the image of myself, the feeling, the idea of myself, and the keeping intact of that image and idea of myself being the paramount concern and emotion. The fear of that feeling, image, idea of self being injured, damaged, in my own eyes and in the eyes of others. That's what we mean by self-centeredness or selfish motive. The keeping intact of what one can see one is attached to. Because if it is hurt, if somebody criticizes, one is hurt or becomes defensive, and that indicates attachment. We have gone through that in one talk very carefully. So what about this? I think is a very interesting question. Am I just gentle and kind and friendly or non-aggressive with people because I'm afraid to hurt them, and then afraid that they may hurt me back, or that having hurt them makes me feel guilty, or I won't be able to stand being with somebody who's hurt? That's for all of us to look at as we relate and interrelate with each other. And it is a very, very significant thing to ask and to look, because it has deep implications of going along with things that one may see as being hurtful, but being afraid of saying anything about it, doing anything about it, for fear of offending and fear of retaliation. This goes on politically all over the world, not just in dictatorships. It goes on right in this country. Fear of saying anything to the boss, because he may not like to hear, or may demote one or throw one out. There was a very interesting play in Germany right after the war. I know it's been played in this country too. I think it was by Max Frisch, called Biedermann and the Fireflies, or Firebugs. You may have seen it. And that play was to symbolize, to portray very dramatically what happens if there is fear of saying anything, even though one sees the danger from the beginning. If I remember right, it's an older couple living downstairs and having an empty attic, and two thugs asking whether they could live in the attic of the house. I forget all the details of it. All I remember is an escalating bunch of demands by these two people on the people who live downstairs. Outrageous demands which are acquiesced in and fulfilled for fear that these guys may do something to us. One of their last requests being to move barrels of inflammatory material into the attic. And the end being everything going up in fire. Consumed. Everybody. The play was so good because one could tell, one could move along with this, the fear of saying something. So, how does one talk and mention things or clarify things as one lives together? Not just tolerating to be tolerant and not offend, but to have that intelligence that sees whether it's appropriate and meaningful to say something. And then regardless of the consequences, to say something, to do something that is seen to be the right thing to do, not right in contrast to wrong, but the right thing to do, not to go along with what is obviously destructive or irritating, damaging. Not just in a total sense of the conflagration of the whole earth or house, but in our interrelationship. And that takes this careful self-seeing or attention. Where one's words or observations come from? Do they just come from being irritated by somebody? Because we talked about that yesterday. What one can't tolerate in oneself, one can't tolerate in someone else. Or little vendettas and things like this. Or is there clarity inside that there is no such motive? It's just seeing that something may be helpful to be pointed out or to be done. Regardless if all of us participating in this get hurt or offended. because continuing with something unawares which is harmful to an intelligent way of living together is also hurt. That also hurts. When one may belong to a group, and after real careful examination see that what is going on in the group continues self-image, feeling of superiority or elitism or separateness among the whole human community, and one may say no to that and step out of it and hurt many people in the process. People who don't see it that way are attached, feel attachment threatened, and the fear that comes up with threatened attachment, the fear rising. So can one, step by step, moment to moment, examine whether there is selfish motive in it, and if there is, if the motive is seen and it dissipates in the seeing, is the action still valid? It may still be valid. Just needing to be freed of the selfish motive, which is detectable and dissipatable in seeing it. But living in a community or in a family, at work, how do we talk to each other, relate to each other? Just because I don't like how somebody acts, just to confront that person with it rudely. Does that do any good? Does confrontation just bring about inevitable defense and retaliation? One has to feel these things. Or can one talk together if there is interest in everyone who's involved in this? Talk together, not being so personal about it all, but being on that level on which we all participate and partake of the same characteristics, more or less, so that one isn't just pointing a finger at somebody else, but is also looking at oneself at the same time. So that there needn't be defensiveness. We're all looking at the same thing. It's not just personal, it's commonly shared. Greed, anger, fear, and jealousy. I think it all depends on how we speak to each other and how we receive what is said. And keep working at it. If a hurt happens, to talk about it, to question it, not just to take it for granted, that it must happen inevitably and it didn't need to happen, you didn't have to hurt me. But to go deeper, not to just keep sliding along the surface. And feeling it, one is incapable of seeing, looking deeper. So coming back to how we started, observing, maybe during a quiet week of a deepening of attention, awareness, observing this almost constant involvement in self-center, self-image, feelings for the self coming out of the self. What is one going to do about it? Will the clarity of the observation, the truth of the observation immediately be covered over under like a landslide of self-deprecation, guilt, fear, conflict because what I see doesn't conform to the image I've held all my life, that I am not so selfish, I'm altruistic, or whatever image one may have nurtured. We all have these images which don't conform to the way we are. Or will that awareness, can that awareness stay open, aware of these onslaughts of thought and judgment, and not be buried by them? Because you see, what is of utmost essential significance in a human life is that this awareness come into being. Which is a new dimension, a new mode of being, which reveals things. What is revealed is what is revealed. Self-centeredness. But the important thing is that this awareness keep going and not be denied for fear of what one sees, or disgust, depression over it. Shame, guilt. In guilt and shame and depression, there's no awareness. There's the body is inundated with the thoughts and feelings that go with these moods. So we talked about that before. Can the arrival of such a mood, the arrival of a barrage of self-criticism or judgment, can that be detected early so it doesn't bury, doesn't just inundate the body with anger about oneself, resentment, or resentment of others who made me this way. The fault-finding trip that we're all so familiar with, looking for faults in others for what I discover in myself. All the self-pity pit, the deep pit one can fall into. Can awareness, as one goes, throw light on all of this so it doesn't flourish and grow vines and roots all over the place? Then the weeding seems that much more arduous. although one has to be careful in saying that, awareness can cut through anything at any time. And yet a thought, when it is seen immediately and therefore doesn't trigger the whole organismic reactions, then the clarity is there. It isn't blacked out, covered with a rubble. With which I'm not saying control, let's control ourselves. This has nothing to do with control or repression. It is the intelligence of seeing. Seeing right at the start what we have been through 10,000 times in the past. We know it. One doesn't have to go through it time and time again. If one does, then no regrets, just to see it whenever awareness dawns. To let the body, to give the body its time that it needs to calm down from an attack of anger or anxiety. By not resisting it or resenting it. Allowing it to run its course, together with the myriad things of this world. So if one sees one's life has been superficial all along, without much depth, with not much feeling for other people, first of all, let's be careful too that one doesn't get entangled in a description of oneself. It has to suspect it. Because we have also a conditioned way of describing ourselves to ourselves, which goes along patterned ways, maybe the way we've been talked about when we were younger or very little. And parents, teachers, relatives talk about children thinking they don't hear, but they hear very early. So, is one caught up in this summary one gives of one's life that in itself may be an excuse not to go any further? I'm superficial. No depth to me, and stay in that cloud of description. Important thing is seeing from moment to moment what's there, and let that seeing act, because if it is clear, unclouded by what I want to see and what I don't want to see, unclouded by the self-center, then there is intelligence in it, and that will act, that does act. In an unbeholden way. One person said, what you're talking about, this seeing of self-image and the freedom from it, sounds to me like death, like dying. And that arouses fear. And that fear may be the blockage in looking, in attending. The blockage not to look, not to attend. The fear that if this attending may lead to dying to the self-image, then where am I going to be? I don't want to disappear. This in itself is the operation of thought, isn't it? Thinking about what would happen if there was no self-image, no self-memory or cluster of ideas. And speculating, how would I feel if I didn't have that? And concluding, it wouldn't be nice. I wouldn't have what I hang on to, what I like, what I want to happen in my future life, what I review I've liked in my past life, and so on. Thought. Speculation, conclusion. And the emotions aroused, namely fear and hesitancy, resistance. That's what the person mentioned particularly. I feel a resistance to this work, and I think this is why it is. This fear of dying to the idea of myself. This death or dying to the idea of oneself is nothing that thought can figure out, plan for, or get to know. Anything that can be known, can be made into knowledge, we can deal with. We feel we can deal with it. And if we feel we can deal with something, we don't have to be so afraid of it. And yet the very act of dying, whether it is dying to an image or dying when this life, the life of this organism, comes to an end, is not knowable. It has nothing to do with thought. Thought tries to hover over it like flies hovering over a dead body. Just recently saw a little dead woodchuck lying in the meadow. It was almost invisible, so many flies around. This is how thought hovers over certain ideas, trying to figure out something and not being able to resolve it. Can one see that intellectually? Is that intellectually clear that thought cannot imagine its own absence? It's logically clear. As long as thought functions, it functions. It's not absent. So it's not within its power or capacity to understand or figure out its own absence. And that causes fear. But fear may be totally unfounded. The fear comes through what we've just described. The awareness of image and the dissipation of image, the ending of an image or the ending of an attachment, may be anything but frightening. When the idea of will I continue, how will I continue, what will happen to me, when that idea isn't rumbling around in the mind, there is no fear. All our fears are connected with the idea of myself, continuing or not continuing, how I will continue. So it's the very thoughts about myself and the attachment to these ideas about myself, my continuous story, they are the cause of fear. Fear of that story coming to a finish. And the inability to experience in imagination this finish, except that one can imagine all kinds of things. That dying means being buried alive or so, which is imagination. That's not what dying is. Dying is dying. Is not continuing. In imagination, we're not talking about physical, organismic death right now. So can one see the unfoundedness of the fear, albeit how it is triggered, and the reality of it once it is experienced physically, the disagreeableness of the physical symptoms of fear? But that all of that has nothing to do with the ending of self-image, the actual ending of self-image in the light of awareness, in the wholeness of awareness. So what we're afraid of, it seems, is our own thoughts. Our projections and imaginations. Sometimes somebody will ask, if there's no feeling of self, will there be any joy left? In this life? if one asks a question like this, one has to also question and look at what are the joys or pleasures of the self. Usually we've used the word joy particularly for that state of being when there is no feeling of self, as everything is as it is, the immediacy of relationship, or one doesn't even need to call it relationship because it's not I'm related to that, there's just what's there, the beauty of it, the harmony of it. Whereas we've used the word pleasure to denote that state which is always mixed up with some thought. Remembrance. How nice it was and I wish it would be like that again. Or a moment of joy and immediately wanting to keep that, making it into something, into a picture, and wanting to keep that. Have it again, have it last forever. Which is, again, the functioning of thought. The same thought which also causes all of our pains and fears and suffering. What will happen to me? Or what happened, I hope it won't happen again, but it might. So how trustworthy are these pleasures that we're afraid of losing if there is the dying? To self, to the idea and image of self, at a moment of clarity and awareness. Seeing self-image come up and the ending of it, the seeing being the ending. Not for all times of future eternity, that's thought again. It'll be met as it comes up. One cannot bring about this awareness by willpower or desire, or we've talked about that, practicing for it, but we can all see what's in the way. Go through things the way we've just been going through. What is it that one is afraid of? Because we are capable of thinking for ourselves, seeing for ourselves. If there's really a vital interest in it. Vital meaning one can bring energy to it. Because one sees how essential it is not to be trapped in unfounded and yet persistent ideas. Some people say, I'm afraid that if there is not this feeling and attachment to self, I'll lose my mind. What is this mind, which is the accumulation of memory, attachment, fear, desire, and me in the middle? Can one see at a glance that it is not the openness of hearing, the wind, the birds, the breathing, the warmth or coolness of the breeze, without needing anything from it? Just it's there. It needs no thought. Thought may come up, but that doesn't need thought, or label, or explanation. It functions completely freely without all of that. With all the rain we had, that little river became a gushing, muddy brown stream. Lots of noise. You could hear it just stepping out of the door up here last night. Don't hear it right now. In a few days it may run clear. There's a lot of sun. There may be just a bare trickle. Deer come to it and drink. Trees fall into it. Algae grow in it. Who controls all of that? What's in the center of that? With which we're not saying that there is no proper function to thinking. Clearly we have to think. But do we think clearly? Intelligently? Out of seeing the facts, the situation as it is. And also seeing where thought can only raise havoc. Where it does not have any function other than habitually running. we will end here for today.